Hello everyone, welcome to this talk on Brexit. We are very happy to have here today Dr. Tim Oliver, who is an expert on Brexit, and no doubt he's an expert because he has been working on Brexit since the first time David Cameron, the former Prime Minister of Britain, announced the possibility of a referendum on Brexit. So it has been his field of expertise since at least 5 years now. Dr. Oliver is acquainted with NYU students because he was visiting at NYU New York. He will probably be back in the next semester. This semester, he will be here thanks to a Jean Monnet Fellowship at the European University Institute, which is an institute for postgraduate studies based in Florence. He's also an associate at the London School of Economics, and he's the editor of a number of books on Brexit, which are about to come out. We can't wait to put our hands on. They will be out in the spring, apparently, so we will put them immediately on order with our library. So thank you, Tim, for accepting our invitation. It's really a great privilege for us. We're all anxious about Brexit, so we hope we will feel better and relieved after your talk. We will see.
Relieved, okay. I've got that.
Okay, you've got one.
Thank you very much. This is working then, excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much for that very warm welcome, and thank you for coming today. It's wonderful to be back at NYU, albeit here in Florence, just over the valley from where I'm based at the EUI. I was based at NYU for a couple of months in the program of international relations run by Professor Mike Williams, who I've known for quite a few years. We did our PhDs together at the London School of Economics. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is a topic that has, for me, it's always been floating around in my research, even back when I started my PhD at the LSE at the same time as Mike, but really came into my life back in 2013, almost 5 years, well, just over 5 years ago, when David Cameron committed the Conservative Party to holding an in-out referendum. And this has dominated my life since then, especially since the referendum in 2016. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is why that happened, what the background is to this, what the causes of Brexit are, what that means, what the consequences are. And not just for the UK, but also for the EU. I believe you're visiting Brussels in a few weeks' time, in which case I might try and give you some ideas and some questions to put to some of the people you meet in Brussels about what Brexit means for them and what mistakes or lessons the European Union can learn about Brexit. Because Brexit isn't just a consequence of British politics, it's also arguably a consequence of European Union politics. Now, just to say, I do have 2 books coming out. Like any good academic, I'll plug my books. They're coming out this spring/summer. The first one is an edited volume, Europe's Brexit, EU Perspectives on Britain's Vote to Leave, which has a foreword by Herman Van Rompuy, the former president of the European Council. This looks at how every other member state of the European Union and the EU's institutions responded to Brexit. And this has been, for me, one of my main areas of research for 5 years. Because when I started working on Brexit, I was based in Berlin at the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik, a German think tank, and I found myself as the only Brit at this German institution at a time when David Cameron and the UK was essentially maneuvering itself towards a referendum and became this lightning rod for German frustrations about British behavior, which I'll talk a bit more about in a moment. And when people ask me, don't you know what this would mean for Britain to leave the EU? I point out, well, yes, I do, but what's your answer to my question, what would it mean for the EU? And I'd get blank looks. There is more literature, or there was more literature, on how a state such as Texas or Alaska or California might secede from the Union of the United States than there was about how a member state might leave the European Union. That's changed now. We've got a lot more literature because of Brexit. But until a couple of years ago, the idea of a member state leaving the EU was a taboo. I'll come back to that. So one of my main areas of interest has been how the rest of the EU respond to this. And this is what this book here tries to cover. The other book, which will be out a little later, sometime in June, Understanding Brexit, A Concise Introduction, is a kind of a textbook on Brexit. It tries to grapple in under 70,000 words with why Brexit happened, what the historical causes were, what happened in the referendum, what happened afterwards, and what's happening now. And it's a topic if you're trying to study a topic that's unfolding right in front of your very eyes, then writing a textbook's very difficult because you have to draw a line at some point and say, well, this is what I'm going to study up to. But what I've tried to do in the book is set out how Brexit unfolds in terms of a series of processes that you can foresee in terms of, well, we know the EU is going to have to deal with these consequences. We know Britain is going to have to deal with these. We know that internationally there are going to be these consequences in terms of transatlantic relations, in terms of the WTO, what they'll lead to. Fine, you can set out different projections, but at least you can structure the way in which Brexit is going to unfold. And that's something I've tried to do in that book. And I'm going to talk a bit more about that today, because what I'm really going to talk about in terms of the causes, the consequences, and the meaning are what I end understanding Brexit on in terms of a series of questions. And here they are. 15 questions, which I'll kind of skim over today, just to give you some background on Brexit. So to start with the causes, why did 51.9 or 52% of the British people who voted vote leave? Why was that when the pollsters, when the British government, when overwhelmingly the British political, economic, cultural, you name it, the British elite said, vote remain, stay in the European Union? Why, despite that overwhelming opinion, did 52% of the British people who voted, remember, it's only 52% of those who voted on a 72% turnout, why did they vote leave? Why, however, did 48% still vote remain? And that's an important question, as I'll come back to, because Britain has strong levels of Euroscepticism. Yet despite that, Britain still very nearly voted remain. So why did 48% of people vote remain in one of the most Eurosceptic countries in the Union? Then we'll look at questions about, well, was Britain destined to leave? How could it have handled this problem? Why did David Cameron call a referendum? Was that the right approach to actually try to grapple with Brexit and the question of European British politics that I'll explain a bit more in a moment? And then you can look at the kind of the consequences. What's happened? What has the referendum done for British politics and the way we debate Europe? Has it settled what we term the European question in British politics, or has it just turned it upside down and caused more questions than answers? What does it mean for the European Union? As I said, it was a taboo to question the idea of a member state leaving the European Union. When I started asking questions about this, people reacted in a very hostile way because you were asking and you were putting forward an idea that challenged the idea of the European Union being an ever forward-moving, integrating project, a kind of a very positive international, liberal internationalist project that the European Union is seen as. And challenging that was something that was deeply unsettling for quite a large number of people. But it's not just about the EU. Where does this leave Europe in terms of European geopolitics? Because you now have a very large European state that's no longer a member of the predominant organization of European politics, economics, and non-traditional security, NATO being the kind of the dominant player when it comes to defense. So what does this mean for Norway, for Switzerland, for Ukraine, for Turkey, Iceland, and maybe also for Russia? But also what does it mean for relations with the United States, transatlantic relations, and a European geopolitical framework, which you can't just understand with regard to the EU. You've got to think about other players to understand the EU and Brexit. And then the meaning. Theresa May, when she became Prime Minister after David Cameron resigned after losing the referendum, said that Brexit means Brexit. That was her answer to the question, well, what do we do now? Well, saying Brexit means Brexit is, as I think a reporter for the New York Times pointed out, it's a bit like telling a toddler that bedtime means bedtime. You know there will be a bedtime. When, how, and where, to some extent, is open to negotiation and change. It's not very clear what Brexit is supposed to mean. Defining Brexit, whether as a narrative in British politics in terms of what the British people voted for, in terms of a policy that the British government will pursue to implement in terms of achieving a negotiation with the European Union in terms of a new relationship, in terms of what it means for British politics. This is all up in the air. It's one of the biggest questions. What exactly Brexit is supposed to mean? And it's not clear. Even the British government struggles to define what it wants Brexit to mean. And I'll explain why that's the case in a minute. We can also look at what theories to use. I'll come back to that in a moment, because as academics, as students, you should be thinking about this not just in terms of what you read in the newspapers, but how to structure your understanding of what Brexit means for the European Union, for Britain, for international relations, for our study of political science, and so forth. And Also, whether or not, well, how to judge whether or not Brexit has been a success or a failure, whether it's what we term sometimes historians term a critical juncture. Is this that moment that Britain's destiny is changed irreversibly because of one choice? Usually a critical juncture, historically, when historians look back on a country's history, is usually a defeat in war or a revolution. It's very rare that you see a country vote in a way to change its economics, its politics, potentially its unity, its place in the world, its security relationships, to change them in such a profound and possibly irreversible way. So is the Brexit vote, a critical juncture in Britain's history? And is it also a critical juncture for the European Union as well? And that's an important question I'll come back to. And then there's the question about whether or not what happens, or what drove Brexit, how Brexit's unfolding, can be applied elsewhere. Donald Trump, as you all know, said that his election was Brexit plus, plus, plus. So can you say that Donald Trump and Brexit have things in common? To some extent you can, but there are also great differences. Can you say that Brexit represents a certain attitudes towards globalization and interconnectedness and so forth across the Western world? To some extent, yes, but at the same time, we've got to be careful because some of the things that drove Brexit are very unique to the United Kingdom and can't really be said to apply to the United States or to Germany or Slovenia or anywhere else. But let's just, for the moment, ask ourselves, just go back to that theory question. How should you study Brexit? What is it about it that you need to get to grips with? What is it about it that fascinates? What is it about it that you should ignore and focus upon? Well, firstly, let's just ask ourselves why study this. What is it about Brexit that so fascinates people, that so consumes British political debate, has made it one of the key issues in the European Union, that has made it an issue in political science and the study of international relations that almost stands alone. It's almost become a field in itself. There is a flood of PhD students now coming through who want to study Brexit, which is always a good sign that it's become this single issue in the political sciences and international relations that deserves to be studied. Well, there are three reasons. First, if you can understand Brexit, if you can understand what caused Brexit and what Brexit is now about, you can understand the contemporary United Kingdom. It is the issue in British politics. It has consumed British politics. It has consumed the time of the Prime Minister and the Cabinet, the political parties, Parliament, the media, academia. One of the most difficult questions you could ever ask anybody who works on Brexit as an academic, for example, is to ask them, what would you have been working on if Britain had voted Remain? Because suddenly we remember that there's another life that we could have been leading if Britain had voted differently. But Brexit has so consumed our lives that it's become almost omnipresent. It's there all the time. So if you can understand this topic, you can understand the central debate within British politics and therefore the UK as a country. The UK is also a great case study for the social sciences, for international relations, for studying the European Union. If you go to the EU's archives just up the road here, you'll find out that one of, if not the most researched topic in the European Union's history is usually the history of UK-EU relations. That's partly because of the English language, but it's also because the UK's struggle to fit in with the European Union makes for such a fascinating case study to try and understand how the European Union has evolved and how a member state has tried to shape or been shaped by the European Union. The UK is also a good country that, if you study international relations, that's not anymore a superpower as it was in the days of the British Empire, but it's not a small power. It's a nuclear-armed permanent member of the UN Security Council. It's not an economic superpower, but it's not a small regional economic power either. So it's very difficult to pin down where it is. It's a country that shows gives very good examples of how a country transitions from being a global hegemon to being something else, and their sort of struggles in terms of its identity, its potential, its willingness to do certain things in the world. It's also a good country to study in terms of economics because of things like Thatcherism, for example, which connect with Reaganomics and so forth. In terms of constitutional change, Britain has been in a state of constitutional flux for the past 10 to 15 years as our constitution has changed a lot. We've had debates about secession in the form of Scotland with regard to Northern Ireland. If you're a psephologist, Britain's electoral systems make it a fascinating case study because we have more electoral systems in the UK than almost anywhere now in the developed world. So Britain is a great case study, especially when it comes to Brexit. What is it about this country that didn't fit in with the European Union? What does it mean for the European Union? If you can study Brexit, you can gain a very good insight into how the European Union itself operates and has evolved. And 4, it also gives us pointers to the future about the European Union and international relations and the state. What does Brexit tell us about how a modern state, in the form of the United Kingdom, deals with the interconnectedness of economics, political, and security relationships that define its relations with the world? And you can deal with this to some extent when you think about the theories. Let's just skip down to the bottom one, the kind of the structure and agency debate. You might have all heard of this, especially in sociology, about whether it's the structures of international relations, the structure of society, the structure of the economy, the structure of the political norms that define the world, that bind countries, bind individuals, bind groups, and so forth, or is it the agency that defines international relations, the ability of a country, a group, a nation, whatever it is, do they have the agency to shape their position in the world? Brexit is a good example of this. Is Britain bound by the structures of its economic, political, security, social links that have connected it to the rest of Europe? Do they bind it in such a way that its options in leaving the European Union are so limited that actually it just has to accept that it's not going to leave the European Union in anything but a formal sense? Or does it have the agency, does it have the ability to actually break away and do something completely different to how the rest of the European Union behaves? That's one way in which you can look at this. You can also take good old, mainly international relations approaches in terms of looking at this in terms of a realist sense. If you're an international relations scholar, actually is Brexit going to be defined by the global distribution of power, and that Britain does have some ability to break away from the European Union, but doesn't, so you're going to focus on that? Are you going to be a constructivist, where you focus on the ideas that have driven Brexit, the ideas that drive European integration, the way they shape the way in which the UK and the EU respond to one another as they move forward? Are you going to look at it in terms of institutionalism, in terms of the institutions that bind together the European Union and the United Kingdom, in terms of what they can and cannot do? You're going to get down into the bureaucratic politics of understanding how the British government has approached this, what it knows it can and cannot do, the culture within inside government. You're going to study that. Remember, theories often put off people. People tend to run away from the word theory. Not just students, some academics as well, but theories are just, imagine them as like a torch that light up some of the most important aspects of a development that you're supposed to focus on. Is it, with regard to Brexit, going to be the best to focus on the bureaucratic politics, for example, to understand the processes by which Brexit unfolds? Is focusing on that going to tell you the most about how Brexit unfolds and what it means and so forth? But there are lots of other areas. One area which which I was conscious of as I was writing the book, is the gender issue in this. The debate is almost entirely male-dominated. You can see it just in the readings, even in my own book. At the end of each chapter, I list 10 suggested readings in terms of further readings, and it's almost entirely male-dominated. The referendum campaign itself was almost entirely male-dominated. The Brexit campaign, or the Brexit negotiations, apart from Theresa May, are almost entirely male-dominated. And that has not passed unnoticed amongst those who study gender. But let's start with the causes. What exactly caused this? Why did Britain leave the European Union? Well, let's just start by going back a little bit further and ask ourselves, why did the United Kingdom join the European Union in the first place? If you don't understand the history of the UK-EU relations, you're not really going to understand why Britain's found itself in the position it is today. Britain avoided joining in the early phases of European integration in the 1950s to the early 1960s. Its experiences of the Second World War were fundamentally different to those of the rest of Western Europe. It had survived without being invaded, partly because of its island status, but also because it didn't rely upon others on the continent. It was able to rely upon the British Empire in the form of contributions from Canada, Australia, India, and so forth, but also, key for the United States here, it was able to depend upon the United States intervening on its behalf and supporting it in asserting itself within Europe. So it didn't have to rely upon France, it didn't have to rely on Poland or anybody else in Europe. That lesson of being able to stand apart from the rest of Europe, that strategic lesson of depending upon others, whether the Empire or the United States, sits deep within Britain's strategic culture, which is you can't rely entirely upon other powers elsewhere in Europe. You've always got to have others from outside to balance Britain's position within Europe. That's long been the case. The British Empire itself was developed to some extent to give Britain the resources to assert itself within Europe. The loss of the American colonies at the end of the American War of Independence shook Britain's confidence as a power within Europe because it couldn't draw on anymore the resources and the wealth of its colonies across the Atlantic. So that thinking has always been there within British strategic decision-making. And it certainly was there after the Second World War. Why, having survived and been independent during the Second World War, now commit to binding your coal and steel communities, as the EU began, with countries like Germany and France and the Benelux and so forth, when, as Britain had learnt in the Second World War, independence and separation was going to be the way to survive. But it also reflects that Britain has historically a very different political culture to that you find elsewhere in Western Europe. It's majoritarian, it's common law, which conflicts with the system set up elsewhere. At the time, Britain thought of itself as a global power. It had won the Second World War. It might have been almost bankrupt, exhausted, and so forth, but nevertheless, it had an empire to police. It had a global role. It had a permanent membership of the UN Security Council. Throwing in your lot with the likes of France and Germany and the Benelux countries and so forth didn't sit well with British decision makers thinking about their country's position in the world. This was despite the fact that one of the grandfathers of European integration was Sir Winston Churchill, but even Churchill had doubts about this. He felt that Britain and the British Empire and the United States would assist European integration and assist Europeans cooperating with one another. The idea of actually Britain committing to this was deeply unsettling. That changed partly because of Britain's relative decline and the success in the early phases of European integration of the European Economic Community, that the EEC as it was seemed to be the future. It was booming, it was doing quite well. It was also becoming the predominant political organization within Western Europe for economic, social, and non-traditional security matters. As I said, the traditional security matters have remained NATO-focused. But the UK realized quite soon, arguably by the late 1950s, but early 1960s definitely, that it needed to be inside this organization to shape it. It needed to be inside this organization to benefit from it, because being outside, it felt like it was being left in the slow lane economically and politically within Europe. Britain's membership, however, ran into problems. General de Gaulle of France vetoed it several times, saying that he didn't think Britain was European enough. Actually, what he meant was, I don't want Britain challenging French leadership within the European Economic Community. That was despite all the other members wanting Britain to become a member. Britain eventually therefore became a member in the 1970s, so it joined late. It had a difficult membership application. It was unwilling to join. It felt like a resignation of a larger role in the world, so it felt like a step down rather than a step up. The idea of European integration as an end in itself never sat well with the British public. It was always sold to the British public as being about economic gains and being about an economic transactional relationship in terms of what can we get out of this for our wealth and possibly our security. The end goal of ever closer union, as the European Union has been founded upon to some extent, was never something that sat very well with the British people. It was always about securing economic gains and market access. Britain, therefore, had a very difficult relationship with the European Union. You can summarize this through the term an awkward partner, which was a term coined by Stephen George in the early 1990s to describe why Britain had been an awkward partner within the European Union, because it had different economic links with other parts of the world, its political culture, its late membership and so forth, clashed with the culture elsewhere within the European Union. But note, Stephen George's title, the title of his book is An Awkward Partner. It's not the awkward partner. Every member state of the European Union is at some point a pain in the arse. Britain, to be fair, has never or had never rejected an EU treaty. If you look back at it historically, it didn't bring the Eurozone to the verge of collapse. It had an excellent record in enforcing EU law. It has been at the forefront of pushing forward European integration in a very quiet way, which hasn't been appreciated by the British people. Even people like Mrs. Thatcher, who are now thought of as key Eurosceptics, back in the 1980s, she was at the forefront of laying down the architecture of the modern European Union in terms of being a free market, liberal, enlarged European Union that we know today. So Britain has been an awkward partner, not the awkward partner, but arguably more awkward than most. But at the same time, it's also been a quiet European. It has been pushing forward European integration because even Britain, even British decision makers have known that European integration has benefited Britain in terms of market access, in terms of providing the United Kingdom with a big economic power behind it to give it a voice in the world. So when Britain wants to be able to say things in the world, it knows it has the European Union behind it. That's always been something that British decision makers have sought, but they've never wanted to talk about this with the British people. They've never wanted to give a pro-European message to the British people because it's not sat very comfortably with the narrative of Britain as an independent, sovereign, great power. depending upon others, doesn't sit comfortably with that idea. This led to a situation back in 2013 where David Cameron faced a problem. He was Prime Minister in a coalition government from 2010 to 2015 with the Liberal Democrats, Britain's most pro-European pan-UK party. He also faced growing levels of Euroscepticism in British opinion polling. He also faced the rise of a party in the form of UKIP, the UK Independence Party, which was putting pressure on Conservative seats. He also faced, crucially, that his backbenchers weren't comfortable with the idea of Britain being in the European Union. They wanted Britain to renegotiate its relationship and seek a new relationship with the European Union or leave the European Union. Cameron, therefore, had conceded to his Eurosceptics in several ways. He'd offered them things such as he'd withdrawn the Conservative Party from what's called the EPP, the European People's Party, which is the group of European Christian Democrat and conservative kind of centre-right parties that sits within the European Parliament. He'd withdrawn from that because it was seen by his backbenchers as too federalist. He'd offered them concessions in terms of a review of Britain's relations with the European Union called the Balance of Competences Review, which is basically a review of the powers that the European Union has vis-a-vis the United Kingdom. This was the biggest review ever undertaken by any member state of what powers the European Union has. This was undertaken over 2 years, I think. It was the most detailed review ever undertaken, and its conclusion was basically that the distribution of powers between the European Union and the UK was just about right. That didn't go down very well with Eurosceptics in the Conservative Party, who felt like the balance of power tipped too much in the European Union's favour, and Britain was being left as a country that lacked sovereignty, couldn't make its way in the world, couldn't do things that were in its own benefit and so forth. But this huge review concluded, actually, no, the balance is just about right. So for that reason, it was banished to the archives, and you never really hear about it. But by 2013, he was coming under intense pressure from his own party to make some form of commitment to handle the European question within the Conservatives and also within British politics more broadly. It wasn't just Cameron that was grappling with the problem of Europe within British politics. The Labour Party was as well. The Labour Party, therefore, was, by 2015, committed to a referendum of some sort. Even the Liberal Democrats, the most pro-European party in Britain, had committed at some point to an in-out referendum. But they had just little different caveats about when this would or would not happen. They didn't think it should happen as soon as Cameron did. Cameron decided that he would seek a renegotiation and a referendum. So I just realized this is the reasons why he was going to do this. One of the reasons also, to be fair on him, and also on British politics, was that it wasn't just about changing tensions within British politics and attitudes towards the European Union. It also reflected a changing European Union, especially with regard to the Eurozone. Britain had decided in the 1990s that it was not going to take part in European integration with regard to a single currency. There had been debates about whether Britain should have a referendum on this. That had never happened. Opinion polling told us, and has told us for a long time, that support for joining the euro in Britain was always exceptionally low. It never went above something like 20, 25% at most. So the idea of winning a referendum on a topic like this was something that really put off even the most pro-European prime ministers like Tony Blair, who, they toyed with the issue, but then realized, no, this is just doomed to fail. So Britain had stayed out of the Eurozone. But the Eurozone was now the heart of the European Union. It was about 3/4 of the EU economy, 3/4 essentially of the European Union was the Eurozone. So how could Britain fit into a European Union where the heart was now the Eurozone rather than the European Union as a whole? It also reflected that after 40 years of, nearly 40 years of membership, the European Union Britain had joined back in the 1970s. Yes, there'd been a political goal, but it had mainly at the time been about economic integration with a political goal at some point. It was becoming increasingly clear that there was some form of far more clear political goal in mind with regard to European integration, and therefore this was putting pressure on British politics in terms of, is this what the British people want? And it wasn't just in Britain that you felt that. Across the European Union, you had seen a move from what used to be called a kind of a permissive consensus, where European publics were, they were kind of happy and not really that bothered about their governments pushing forward the European integration. But you'd seen that move to what we term a constraining dissensus, not just in Britain, but across the European Union, where publics became more Eurosceptic, more likely to vote down some form of new treaty, some form of new steps forward with regard to European integration. And Britain was certainly a good example of this, that Britain and the British people had become increasingly skeptical about the idea of European integration. There was one big aspect to this that had become connected to Europe, the European question in British politics, that certainly weighed heavily on Cameron's mind, and that was immigration. Immigration in Britain, like in most countries, has always been a key issue. It's always been there. Somebody tweeted this morning that if you went back to the polling in the 1970s or the 1960s or 80s, you found that polling in Britain showed that there were high levels of concern about immigration from the Caribbean or from Asia and so forth, despite even at the time the levels of immigration being quite low. So immigration has always been a powerful, very sensitive topic. It certainly, however, became a far more powerful, far more dangerous issue with regard to Europe in the early 2000s. When in 2004, you had a large number of new Eastern European countries, such as Poland, join the European Union, and Britain and Sweden were the only two member states of the European Union at the time that allowed the free movement of their citizens to Britain and to Sweden without putting down any limit. I think other countries were allowed to impose a several-year limit in terms of allowing large numbers of these new citizens to come and work in their countries. So Britain and Sweden were the only two countries that opened their labour markets to new member states. Again, that can actually be taken as a sign that Britain was being a good European. The response and the result was that Britain faced its largest period of inward migration in modern history. We're talking here almost, some of the figures in terms of almost 1 million Polish people and citizens from Eastern European countries coming to Britain over a several-year period. That pushed immigration and the connection to Europe together in a way which became toxic. People became concerned about the pressure this was applying on housing, on transport, on public services, on education. They were concerned about identity questions, about what this was doing to their communities. It became connected eventually to the migration problem from places such as North Africa, the asylum problem with regard to countries such as Sweden, with regard to Syria and Libya and so forth. It became connected into this. It became this big issue of migration is bad. The EU can't let us stop large numbers of people coming to the United Kingdom. So the two connected in a way that put massive pressure on Cameron as a conservative centre-right leader. Especially given UKIP, the UK Independence Party, certainly played on this with regard to being an anti-immigration party. His response then was in 2015, after he won an election he didn't think he'd win. Nobody thought he'd kind of win the 2015 election the way he did in terms of winning an actual majority. Cameron probably thought that he'd win enough seats to be either a minority government or to go into a coalition whereby he could water down his commitment that he made in 2013 to seeking a renegotiation and holding an in-out referendum. But in 2015, he found he had a majority in the House of Commons, and he now had to deliver on this. Bit awkward for him, so he set about trying to do the best job he could. First of all, he wanted a renegotiation. He wanted to show the British people that he could renegotiate Britain's relationship with the European Union. This had happened back in 1975, when Britain had also held a referendum on whether or not to remain in the European Economic Community. Back then, it was the Labour Party that had struggled with the issue of Europe in British politics. And the Labour Prime Minister at the time, Harold Wilson, had come up with the plan that if he renegotiated Britain's membership and then put that to the British people, they'd be more likely to vote Remain, which they did. They did in 1975. I think the result was about 64% Remain. Cameron thought, if I can do that again, the British people, and the polling told him, the British people will be more likely to say, yes, now we've renegotiated our relationship with the EU, now we can stay in, now we can vote to support this. So he did this to show that he could win concessions, that Britain could once again get what it needed out of the European Union. He did it so he could provide cover for a large number of his own MPs who over the years had expressed strong Eurosceptic opinions, partly because the membership of the Conservative Party had become very Eurosceptic, but who didn't actually believe in Britain leaving the European Union. So if Cameron could give them something to cover their move to supporting Remain, then that would aid the campaign. So he basically would say to them, look, you can now go back to your constituencies and say, I used to believe in Britain leaving the European Union, but now we've got a new relationship, I believe we should remain. So it was about covering up for how British politicians have often been very two-faced when it comes to European integration. That privately, they're actually quite comfortable or very keen to see Britain engage, whereas publicly, they've often kind of taken cheap shots at the European Union used it to kind of score political points and express Eurosceptic opinions. He also wanted it to give him time to prepare for the referendum campaign, but given, as I said, that he'd undertaken this huge review only a few years earlier about what the distribution of powers were like between the UK and the EU, and that had concluded that the balance was just about right, he now faced this problem of saying, well, if the balance is about right, what exactly do I want? And the European Union was pointing this out, saying, you did this big review and you said the balance was about right, so you just want a renegotiation for the sake of having a renegotiation. You don't actually want to change anything. To be fair, he did, and he managed to get 4 areas of agreement. He managed to get Britain an opt-out from the European Union's aim of ever closer union. Again, it links back to this idea that the British have never been quite sold on the idea of committing to European integration for the good of European unity. He got a commitment, for what it's worth, that other EU states were committed to competitiveness and seeking trade deals around the world and so forth. That wasn't really a big problem. He got a commitment on the EU-Eurozone relationship in terms of preventing Eurozone members caucusing, so they basically form a group that would make decisions and then tell the non-Eurozone members of the EU, this is what you're going to accept. That had already been a problem that many members of the Eurozone had grappled with. Even countries like Germany were very conscious of this, but Cameron managed to get a few more concessions on this. But the biggest one that he wanted, and he desperately wanted when he set out to achieve a renegotiation, was that he wanted to limit the number of people who could come to the UK. As a member of the European Union, the UK abides by the freedom of movement of goods, capital, services, and labour or people. Because of that, Britain cannot impose any limitations on Germans, Italians, Poles, Estonians, Slovenians, Irish, Danish, and so forth moving to the UK. Cameron wanted to impose a limit. He wanted to be able to say, I want to say only 80,000 citizens from elsewhere in the European Union can come to the UK each year in terms of net numbers. He did this because, as I said, immigration had become an increasingly powerful issue. Cameron himself had made the mistake, and I'll say it's a mistake, of saying several years before that he wanted to see net migration to the UK come down to 100,000 a year. He has never, or Britain has not met that target in several years. Not only because of net migration from elsewhere in the EU, but also because Britain's political economy is dependent upon being a very open economy, not just in terms of capital and services and goods, but also in terms of labour, including from the rest of the world. Britain brings in large numbers of workers from the United States, from China, from Australia, from India, you name it. So meeting that 100,000 figure was never going to be plausible, but he'd never walked it back, which created a bit of a rod for his own back. He couldn't actually, he wanted to get the numbers down, but couldn't, and he definitely couldn't if Britain was going to remain within the European Union without being able to set some limits on immigration. The EU was adamant, you cannot compromise on freedom of movement. This is something that applies to all EU nationals. You can't start discriminating against Poles and Germans and Slovenians and Greeks and so forth. You must continue to allow freedom of movement. Cameron argued, look, we were one of the few countries that opened our labour market in 2004, cut us some slack. The rest of the EU didn't. As a result, he got a tiny concession over benefits, over what EU citizens could claim within the UK, but really that was nothing major. As a result, the renegotiation that he brought back, it didn't really matter. The Conservative Party, or a large number of conservative Eurosceptics, the British media, they ignored it. And Cameron himself quickly ditched the renegotiation when it came to the referendum campaign, because it became increasingly obvious that even though he had managed to negotiate some major concessions from an EU perspective, in British politics, they simply didn't matter. They just weren't going to convince anybody. The campaign then began, and it was defined by several things. First of all, cabinet divisions. Usually the British cabinet, like any cabinet within any executive, speaks with one voice publicly, even if in private they're deeply divided. Cameron had to allow ministers to campaign on different sides. That caused massive problems for him because he wanted to, he called this referendum to try and deal with the European question, not only in British politics, but within the Conservative Party. So he didn't want to deepen the divisions during the campaign, which meant that he held back sometimes in the campaigning approach from having attacks on other Conservative MPs and ministers who were backing the Leave campaign. He backed Remain, but other prominent members of the cabinet, such as Boris Johnson or Michael Gove, for example, were key Leave supporters, and he didn't want to attack them so outright that it would poison relations for after the campaign. The Remain campaign backed its argument mainly on economics. It put forward an argument that leaving the European Union would cost the UK economy considerably. That was the one thing that polling told it the British people were concerned about when it came to leaving the European Union. And to some extent, large numbers of Remain voters did concern themselves about this. But the Remain campaign focused on the economics. The Leave campaign, however, benefited from the fact that there was no single Leave campaign. There were two dominant Leave campaigns. And they were able to perform a flanking maneuver. One Leave campaign, the official Leave campaign, was Vote Leave. This was led by people such as Boris Johnson, the former Mayor of London, who was almost on equal stature to the Prime Minister in terms of reputation, in terms of being known amongst the British people. This was the official Vote Leave campaign designated by the Electoral Commission that got spending money from the British state to send out certain campaign materials and so forth, that was guaranteed certain airtime on the BBC and so forth. This was the official Vote Leave that backed a very libertarian, much more liberal, much more, we want to leave the European Union so we can trade with the rest of the world. We want to control our own laws, but we're also going to be quite pro-foreigners. We're not going to be anti-immigration. So they didn't push on immigration as much as the other Leave campaign, which was Leave.eu, which was mainly a UKIP-funded campaign. This focused heavily on the immigration. It focused heavily on English nationalism, heavily, to some extent, on racism and dog whistle racism. And by doing this, the Leave campaigns were essentially able to perform a flanking maneuver. On one side, you had a very nativist approach that was very hostile to the European Union in terms of almost immigration matters, that campaigned to certain sections of the British society that were clearly going to be like that. But from the other side, you had this more detoxified Leave campaign that wasn't quite so blatantly racist, wasn't quite so blatantly anti-immigration, that was much more open-minded, much more liberal, and so forth, that came at it from the other side. As a result, the Remain campaign was having to fight on two fronts and couldn't defeat both, because both Leave campaigns could basically wash their hands of any responsibility in terms of saying what they'd do next, because they'd say it was the other side making certain arguments. But nevertheless, it benefited the Leave campaign that they were able to put out two contradictory messages. One that was pro-globalization, you might say, one that was anti-globalization, one that was more comfortable with immigration, one that was anti-immigration. As a result, the issue of immigration was not something the Remain campaign was able to easily address. They tried desperately to find ways of addressing the immigration concerns within British politics. They tried with numerous polling groups, they tried with numerous focus groups, you name it. They couldn't find a way to sell the European Union to people who were concerned about immigration. And one thing that pollsters had pointed out, that as the campaign began, it had become obvious that the number one concern in British politics was no longer the economy, it was actually immigration. So the Leave campaign was pushing already on the number one issue which people were concerned with, which was immigration. The Remain campaign was pushing on the second most important issue, which fundamentally weakened large numbers the Remain campaign. There were allegations of post-truth politics, of Russian interference. As has become clear, there has been some evidence of this, but especially with regard to post-truth politics, that both sides, yes, pushed things to the limit in terms of credibility, put forward, like in any campaign, blatant lies, blatant mistruths, misinterpretations. One of the best examples of this is the figure that was bandied about by the Vote Leave campaign, which was that we send the European Union 350 million a week, let's spend that instead on the National Health Service. And this shocked a lot of campaigners, especially on the Remain side. They were kind of like, why are we bringing the NHS into this campaign? But the Leave campaign had correctly identified, just like in any campaign, that it doesn't matter sometimes how you get to the end of winning your vote, as long as you win the vote. And one of the best ways in British politics of connecting any topic to the British people is to bring in the National Health Service. It is the closest that the British have to a national religion. You can't criticize the NHS. Everyone moans about it, but criticizing it is a big no-no. So the idea of taking Britain's budgetary contribution to the EU and then spending it on the NHS is a very simple message which ignored the huge complexities in this, which was you don't send 350 million a week to the European Union. This figure was regularly debunked, but to most people in the British public, all they hear was 350 million, EU, NHS. Well, that makes sense. Why don't we just spend it on that instead of giving it to all these foreigners? So the Leave campaign was able to connect the issue of Europe to lots of issues, especially things like the NHS, even if this is a good example of how, well, this is complete nonsense. But the Remain campaign had no answer to this, or at least it didn't, partly because the person who could have campaigned on the NHS kept quiet in the form of Jeremy Corbyn. Why did then 52% vote Leave and 48% vote Remain? Well, let's break down how Britain voted. On a simple geographical basis, here Remain in blue, Leave in yellow. As you can see, Scotland, Northern Ireland voted in terms of constituencies, all Remain. Here's London. This kind of sketch, this band of blue is what's known as the M4 corridor, which is a highway that connects London to Bristol and Cardiff. Very rich, very productive area of the UK. Certain other areas, such as Liverpool, Manchester, certain urban areas, also voted Remain. That, to some extent, gives you an idea about how Britain voted, especially with regard to these huge swathes of Leave vote here in England and Wales. This poses a problem, and the colours reverse here, sorry, in terms of Leave now being in blue. These are the constituencies that voted Leave. So they're all in blue. The yellow ones are Remain. This is a problem in British politics because on the right, in terms of constituencies, you can see which MPs voted Remain and which voted Leave. So large numbers, if you look in England, large numbers of MPs said they would support Britain remaining in the European Union, but their constituencies and their constituents voted Leave. That causes a problem because the referendum is not legally binding. Under the British Constitution, Parliament is sovereign and can do whatever it wants. So technically, Parliament could have ignored the referendum result and basically said, no, we're going to vote to Remain. That would have been down to these MPs, but they now face a dilemma that their constituents had told them to do something very different. We can break it down in terms of demographics. There was no difference between men and women in how they voted. We all know, I mean, it was no surprise, the younger you were, the more likely you were to vote Remain. The older you got, the more likely you were to vote Leave. Bear in mind, however, that when people say young people are the future and therefore it's only a matter of time before the older generation who voted Leave die out and therefore young people become a majority in terms of becoming Remain voters, in terms of Remain voters becoming a majority, bear in mind that back in the 1975 referendum, it was these people who were the younger generation who voted overwhelmingly for Remain back then, and move forward 40 years, and they're now the generation that vote overwhelmingly for Leave. You can break it down in terms of the class structure that Britain has, in terms of A, B. These are your doctors, managers, academics, lawyers, and so forth. Again, the more higher up the class system you were, the more likely you were to vote Remain. The further down, D, E, unskilled labourers, unemployed, the more likely you were to vote Leave. You can connect it to educational qualifications. So the more likely you were, if you graduated from university, if you had a PhD, you were very likely to vote Remain. If you only left school with what are called GCSEs, which is your General Certificate of Secondary Education, which is the compulsory exam everyone has to take at 16 in the UK, if you only left school with GCSEs or come from the generation before mass qualifications, so the older generation, you were very, very likely to vote Leave. So constituencies with large numbers of graduates, surprise, surprise, they voted Remain. Those without voted Leave. I'll skip this because it never quite comes out clearly enough. In terms of party politics, you can see here how people voted in the 2015 general election and how they voted in the referendum. And the key one here is the top one, the Conservatives. 42% of Conservative voters voted Remain. 58% of Conservative voters voted Leave. David Cameron failed to carry a majority of his own voters. Not just of his own MPs, but his own voters. That, for him, was damning. You know, he'd failed to carry the Conservative Party in this referendum. But at the same time, if you look down, the next one down, the Labour Party, pro-Remain, 37% still voted Leave. The Liberal Democrats, Britain's most pro-European, pan-UK party, 30% voted Leave, despite that party being having long been a dedicated pro-European party. The UK Independence Party, surprise, surprise, 96% voted Leave. That's not a surprise. But even the Green Party, 25% voted Leave. And the Scottish National Party, 36% of its voters voted Leave, despite the fact that the Scottish National Party was very clear that it wanted the UK and it wanted Scotland to remain within the European Union. Despite that, 36% of their voters voted Leave. You can't also connect the Brexit vote to certain attitudes. People look at this often in terms of socioeconomic background, in terms of if you're poor, you're more likely to vote leave. Well, yes, to some extent, but you can also look at it in terms of attitudes. Take, for example, the death penalty. If you are poor but oppose the death penalty, you are more likely to vote Remain. If you're rich and support the death penalty, you are more likely to vote Leave. So when it comes to certain liberal versus authoritarian values, you could see a very strong correlation. So more liberal-minded people, whatever their background, wherever they lived in the UK, were more likely to vote Remain. More people who are more tended towards, let's call it authoritarian attitudes, for the sake of it, were more likely to vote Leave. You can break down how both groups of voters viewed the key issues into kind of word maps, and I think they tell the story in themselves. Leave voters, no surprise, biggest concern immigration, but you can also see sovereignty, control, laws, country borders. Remain voters, the economy, rights. The European Union grants certain privileges and certain rights to UK citizens that they won't get outside the European Union. And then if you take your in-between voters, you're undecided. Well, again, it split almost 50-50. But as I said, immigration had the edge, even amongst the undecided. Was Britain destined to leave the European Union? I ask this because, as I said, Britain has long had a very Eurosceptic debate. It has had problematic relations with the European Union. It's had difficult times. Its politics has often taken a very easy route to kind of attacking the European Union, never saying anything good about it. So was it destined to leave the European Union? To some extent, you can argue something was going to give eventually, not least because of the way the European Union itself was evolving, but also because of the way British politics was moving. It wasn't just Cameron that was committed to an in-out referendum. It was also the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats. So something would have given. Cameron, however, I think went about this the wrong way. He called a referendum at the wrong time. He tried to get a renegotiation that didn't secure anything. He had tried to manage this tension within the Conservative Party by constantly giving away concessions rather than confronting it early on. So in a way, the way that Cameron went about it almost doomed Britain to leaving the European Union. And you've also got to bear in mind that when you look at the opinion polling going back even to 2010, so Leave is the red one starting here, the two have always been very close. It was always going to be one hell of a gamble to call a referendum on this, especially in the context in which you had Britain's politics still being overshadowed by the financial crisis and the Great Recession of 2007, the parliamentary expenses scandal of 2009, which had rocked British politics, a period of austerity in British politics and growing inequality. Even Emmanuel Macron admitted a few weeks ago in an interview for the BBC that if a French politician, if François Hollande had called a referendum in France, it's not guaranteed that the French would have voted Remain because of the context within which this referendum would have happened. Cameron took a gamble, and that's something his biographers often point out. He's a bit of a gambler, and it backfired spectacularly in terms of him losing. So what are the consequences of this, very quickly, given I'm now running out of time? Well, has the result settled the European question in British politics? This is what Cameron set out to do when he committed to holding a referendum. Well, no, it hasn't. It's just changed the question in terms of how Britain is now going to deal with the European Union from the outside rather than on the inside. Europe is not going to go away as a topic in British politics. If anything, for the next few years, it has become the topic in a bigger way than it's ever been before. Does that mean, however, that eventually we might come to some form of new settled relationship with the European Union? No, because again, that depends on how the European Union is going to continue to change in future. And that depends a lot on how Brexit actually changes the European Union itself. Here, let's just call it this. Britain has found itself facing a European Union that is facing two sets of negotiations. From the EU's perspective, they're not just negotiating with the UK over its exit, they're also negotiating amongst themselves how the European Union will change now that one of its largest member states is withdrawing. So what do you do when you have to redistribute the pie because Britain has gone? That raises questions about the budget. There is a huge hole in the EU's budget that will open up after 2020 when the current financial time frame ends for the European Union. Britain is one of the biggest net contributors to the EU's budget, so one of the questions you'll have to ask in Brussels is, what are they going to do to fill that hole? And the answer from the Commission has basically been to say, well, there's going to have to be 50% of it is going to have to be filled in by other countries giving more, and 50% of it is going to have to be filled in by other countries taking less. That doesn't go down very well amongst any member states of the European Union. It's one of the reasons why, during the exit negotiations, Britain and the European Union have been arguing about how much Britain owes to the European Union in terms of things it signed up to. And in December, they both agreed that Britain would pay, or continue to pay, up to about 2020 to the value of about 40 billion pounds up to 2020 in terms of budget contributions. That's essentially Britain paying for access to the European single market in exchange for getting, it'll pay in, but it will also get access in terms of for its trading goods and services and so forth. The EU won't raise any barriers. But that has raised questions in Britain about, well, why are we paying lots of money in when technically, legally, even the European Union has quietly accepted in leaving, Britain therefore isn't legally required to owe anything. Politically, however, that's a different story, as the British government has realized. But it does raise questions for the EU in terms of its budget. It raises questions in terms of the balance of power within the European Union. That will change within the European Parliament most clearly in terms of how the MEPs are redistributed, in terms of qualified majority voting, which, as you all know, happens within the Council in terms of each member state has a certain number of votes according to their population, according to their economy and so forth. That will change because Britain, as one of the biggest members, will leave. Things will be rejigged. That raises questions about how countries will align with one another. Britain has been one of the leading poles within European integration on European politics in certain areas. It's been a liberal-minded Atlanticist country that has pushed for enlargement, so a very wide EU, but also an EU that's had very weak central institutions. Countries that have supported that have often rallied to Britain's side, so it's been the heart of a group of countries within the European Union that have often aligned with each other, such as Sweden and Denmark and so forth. Those countries now find themselves without a big country with whom to support them with their positions. So they're having to maneuver within the European Union to find new alliances. It raises questions about the Franco-German relationship, which has often been the heart of the European Union in terms of the motor of European integration. Britain was often described as a destructive check on France and Germany in terms of their plans. So if Germany was frustrated with what France wanted, it knew it could use Britain to stop it. France was frustrated with Germany, it could use Britain to check it. And if France and Germany were annoyed with Britain, then they'd just get together and try to avoid it. But the three acted almost kind of in check with one another. If you take one of them away, that leaves no other country within the European Union that acts as some form of brake upon European integration and some aspects of Franco-German politics. That has worried other EU countries because they lack now any other countries such as Britain. Italy's not going to play that role. Spain isn't. Poland isn't. Who could play it? Well, no one. So even within even within the debates within the European Union, Germany has begun to recognize that it's probably going to have to concede some extra votes to other member states in the European Union to try and check the Franco-German relationship now that Britain's gone. It also begs the question of where this takes the European Union in terms of its unity. Several years ago, a friend of mine, Rem Korteweg, who's now at Klingendahl, which is a Dutch international relations think tank, he raised the prospect of the European Union being surrounded by the four horsemen of the apocalypse. That you had famine in Greece, bringing hardship and poverty in the Eurozone. You had death in the Mediterranean, harvesting refugees and economic migrants fleeing North Africa. You had war in Ukraine, thanks to Russia playing around with the Baltic states and Ukraine and so forth. And you had pestilence in the form of Britain spreading Euroscepticism. So the EU was surrounded by these four horsemen of the apocalypse, facing four major crises: Brexit, Russia, Schengen, and the Eurozone. There were obviously worries at the time, and there still are worries, that this could lead, or that Brexit, or a British vote to leave, could lead to the unraveling of the European Union. Now, as I said, the idea of a member state leaving the EU is a taboo. The idea of thinking through the unraveling of the European Union was even more of a taboo to people. We had very little theory, very little literature, very little analysis on what European disintegration as opposed to integration would look like. We now have quite a few ideas and quite a few theories, and we can say two things. First of all, Brexit on its own is not going to unravel the European Union. It never was. Actually, what we've seen in the face of Brexit is that support for the European Union in a large number of European countries actually went up, according to opinion polls. So you saw a surge in support for the European Union. However, that comes with a caveat that that doesn't mean they necessarily support some of the means, some further European integration in terms of creating a European some pan-European taxes, or creating a Eurozone finance minister that would be able to impose certain economic policies across the Eurozone and so forth, such as Emmanuel Macron has put forward. So yes, there's been a rally of support for the European Union, but does that mean that there's been a swell in support of overcoming some of the structural problems the EU faces in terms of integrating? No, but Brexit hasn't unraveled the European Union. Second, there's one thing that the European disintegration literature agrees on, and that's that Britain is not important enough to unravel the European Union. The country that is at the heart of European integration and that would be at the heart of any European disintegration is Germany. If Brexit changed Germany's attitudes to European integration, then for the EU, it's kind of game over as we know it. We'd be into a completely different ballgame, but that is not likely to happen. Germany has been very clear from the very start of this, as have other members of the European Union, that the unity of the remaining EU is paramount. It prevails over everything else, including the negotiation with the UK. The UK is the EU's, or the remaining EU's, #1 trading partner, or will become the EU's #1 trading partner when it leaves. Despite that, the rest of the European Union has been very clear. Even if we have to erect certain economic barriers, even if Britain has to be punished in some way for leaving the European Union, if that preserves our unity, that is the cost that we will take. Therefore, it comes down to the question of strategies. What have been the UK and the EU strategies for handling Brexit? Here, it's very clear that when it comes down to it, the UK's strategy has been pretty much chaotic and being made up as we go along, partly because this isn't just about Britain's relations with the European Union, it's also about what type of country Britain wants to be. So British politicians, British ministers have been consumed by Brexit, whereas the European Union has been able to compartmentalize it. The European Commission is running the negotiations, so the member states can kind of wash their hands of it. All the technical details are being handled by a commission that is accustomed to handling big trade negotiations, is accustomed to handling negotiations over member states acceding to the European Union, and therefore it's kind of running this as a kind of a backwards accession negotiation. So you take the negotiations with which a member state usually joins, well, they're just running them in reverse. So they've been there before. For the UK, however, this is a unique challenge, and it's consuming our politics. And the strategy isn't always very clear. It's been made fun of. Even some Eurosceptics in the UK despair the way Britain has gone about Brexit. First of all, ask yourself, what is a strategy? A strategy, and I used to teach at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst. The US equivalent would be West Point. And so every day in class, we'd always be thinking about strategy. What is strategy? Whether it's with regard to environmental security matters, whether it's regard to Britain's relations with the United States, whatever. Strategy, remember, is a combination of ends, ways, and means with an assessment of risk and your opponent's aims. The most important of those is ends. If you don't know what you want to achieve, you can't have a strategy. If you don't know what it is that you're working towards, what your goal will be, you can't therefore configure the ways and means to achieve it, or at least even assess your ways and means. And this has been Britain's biggest problem. It doesn't know what new relationship it wants with the European Union. So bad is the situation that just before Christmas, Michel Barnier, who is the lead negotiator for the European Union, actually put forward to European leaders his, what he termed the kind of the stairway to Brexit. He was able to identify what Britain wanted, basically through the red lines that Britain had set down. So we know what Britain doesn't want, but what Britain wants is not too clear, and even Britain isn't clear. Britain knows that it doesn't want, in leaving the European Union, it wants to end the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. It wants to end free movement. It wants to end paying anything into the European Union's budget. And it wants regulatory autonomy. If that's the case, you can't join the European Economic Area, which is what Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein, if you know where Liechtenstein is on a map, are members of. If that's not an option, then you're down to what's called EFTA, which is kind of the relationship Switzerland has. But again, EFTA comes with free movement. EFTA comes with some form of financial contribution in, and again, it comes with being bound into the regulatory power of the European Union. So you're down to an association agreement like Ukraine has with the European Union. But again, that comes with certain jurisdiction matters for the European Court of Justice. It doesn't allow UK regulatory autonomy. So you're down to a customs union, which Turkey is in with the European Union, where essentially you set a common trade policy and certain common tariffs, so any goods that enter Turkey pay a common EU customs tariff and then can move freely around the EU's customs union. But that doesn't align with what the UK wants because it wants its own trade policy. So you're down to two final things. Either a trade deal that's very similar to that of Canada or South Korea, or the no-deal scenario where you trade on WTO terms. No country in the world trades solely on WTO terms. WTO terms are just the foundation on which everything else is based. The only country I think that might trade on WTO terms is Mauritania. Every other country in the world either has trade agreements with someone else or have agreements over data processing or exchange of certain goods and so forth. So the US and the European Union don't have a trade agreement, but we do have a number of agreements over air traffic, over data exchange and so forth. No country survives on just WTO rules, but that's something that Britain could face if it leaves the European Union without a deal and without some agreement over replicating the EU's deals and agreements with lots of other countries. So what Britain is probably working towards is a Canada-type trade agreement. The British government has talked about this, calling it Canada plus plus plus. What that plus 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 means is not too clear because it comes down to really about regulatory alignment, whether Britain can set its own regulations, whether it can diverge from the EU's marketplace in terms of rules, or whether it's going to have to converge. And this year in British politics, the buzzwords of British politics as we're coming to terms with this are going to be words like equivalence, mutual recognition, harmonization, divergence, convergence. Words you don't often hear being debated in countries. And Britain is going to have this debate this year about what type of trading relationship and regulatory relationship it wants with the European Union. Now, very quickly, because I'm running ridiculously out of time, what is the meaning of Brexit? How are we going to come down to this? Well, as I said, Brexit means what? When Theresa May said this, she said it as a holding point, as she tried to work out what Brexit wants. She now knows that Brexit means some form of EU-UK trade agreement. When that will be agreed is not clear because the time frame is very limited. Everything has to be signed off at least by March 2019 because of the two-year time frame that is set down by something called Article 50, which is the article of the EU's treaties, by which a member state leaves. That's not enough time, so we'll have a transition agreement, but what we're transitioning to is not clear. They're arguing about that right now. Trade agreements can take years to negotiate, and besides, it's not just a trading relationship the UK wants with the EU. Britain has often thought of its relationship with the EU as being about trade and economics. That's not what the relationship is about. It's also about the political, security, and social relationship, especially in terms of the politics and security. Britain wants a say in how the European Union will operate and cooperate in terms of foreign security and defense matters, for example. It wants a say over the European Union's political positions on international issues and with regard to European politics, because the EU will remain the dominant political, economic, and social organization for European politics. And as Winston Churchill put it, even before the First World War, for Britain, Europe is where the weather comes from. Europe is Britain's major strategic concern. So Britain wants some form of relationship that's not just trade, it wants some form of political relationship, but that's going to be very difficult to negotiate. But when we talk about this, we're often overlooking also that this isn't just about the relationship with the European Union. It's also about what type of country Britain wants to be, as it is also for the European Union about what type of union the EU wants to be. So who wins and loses from Brexit? And is this going to be a critical juncture that changes Britain in a certain way? Now, Theresa May, when she became Prime Minister, recognized this, and she started talking about redistributing the British economy, reaching out to people who were Leave voters, who'd felt left behind, alienated by British politics, who felt like they'd been pushed aside, who didn't vote. You hear these debates in the United States about Trump voters, and for me, one of the biggest issues which British politics is not prepared to grapple with is the fact that if you look on this map, you can see the Remain areas are yellow, Leave areas are blue. You can see Scotland voting Remain, Northern Ireland over there voting Remain. You've got areas like Liverpool and Manchester, and then there's this huge blob called London. The United Kingdom is made up of 5 countries: Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, England, and London. If you've only been to London and you say, oh, I've been to England or the UK, no, that's like saying you've been to New York and been to America. You've been to a very different, a very unique place. But London dominates the United Kingdom. It is on 12% of the population, which is not overwhelmingly British anymore. It is about a quarter of the UK's economy and generates about a third of our taxes. It dominates British politics. It is the center of British political, media, cultural, economic life. it causes huge resentment elsewhere in the UK. And Theresa May spotted this. And when she became Prime Minister, part of what Brexit means was supposed to be a redistribution of the UK economy and changing British society so it wasn't so London-orientated. That has fallen by the wayside because she lost an election and has found herself in a minority government struggling just to cope with Brexit. But it's a reminder that when you come down to it, the question of what would a successful Brexit mean, people often think about it in terms of the UK-EU relationship, a new trading relationship and so forth, a new security relationship. No. A successful Brexit is arguably about what the UK wants to be and what the EU wants to be. That's what's going to define this new relationship. But unfortunately in British politics, and to some extent within the European Union, but certainly within British politics, we're putting the cart before the horse. We're thinking about what new relationship we want with the EU before we've actually thought about what type of country Britain wants to be in terms of its society, its immigration, its political economy, its unity, its identity, and so forth. And that is the biggest underlying question, which is not going to go away even if the formal Brexit negotiations end, as they will in the next year. I should stop there because I've gone ridiculously over time.
Thank you very much for this very informative lecture. You gave us so much information. I mean, it's incredible. I think it will take a little time before we elaborate, but if someone is ready with questions, the floor is yours.
So for companies that were based in England, how does Brexit affect their ability to do business with the rest of the EU? And are there specific implications you can think of pertaining to asset management firms who sell products into the EU? Will they be forced to set up in other countries?
Okay, this is one of the biggest issues in terms of what access companies based in the UK will have to the European Union. If Britain gets a Canadian-type trade agreement, trade in goods, fine, because that's in the EU's interest, because the EU sells more goods to the UK than the UK does to the rest of the European Union. The problem is in services, as always in trade negotiations, not just with regard to UK-EU, but internationally, whether it's TTIP, whether it's the EU-Canadian trade agreement, agreeing on services is the biggest and the most sensitive issue. Yet, as anybody who works in trade negotiations know, if you can bring down non-tariff barriers that are obstacles to service trade, that's where you make big progress in trading relations. The European Union is reticent to allow the UK any form of special deal when it comes to services, partly because there's a certain protectionist element within elsewhere in the European Union, that the UK sells lots of services to the EU, more than the rest of the EU does to the UK. There's also a certain hostility to the City of London, which is a legacy of the financial crisis and the idea that Anglo-Saxon economics brought down the Eurozone. Well, actually, the Eurozone's internal problems probably played a bigger role. There's also the concern, which is being addressed today by David Davis, Britain's leading Brexit negotiator, that Britain will try to undercut the European Union by lowering its regulatory standards in lots of areas, and that, if the European Union allows Britain access, then Britain's basically undercutting and cheating. So the European Union is deeply concerned about this, and David Davis apparently is today going to say that actually in leaving the European Union, we're not going to race to the bottom in some libertarian, let's cut all the regulations type way. We're actually going to try and race to the top and try and set international standards. Whether you believe that or not is up to you. But in terms of what it means for certain companies in the UK, the biggest issue here is the issue of passporting rights, because under the European Union rules, any country, any company in any EU country can then trade freely elsewhere in the European Union. It's a system of mutual recognition. Passporting will end when Britain leaves the European Union. So for certain countries, if they want to continue to benefit from certain passporting rules, they will have to set up operations elsewhere in the EU. Lots of them already have. Those operations are small because large numbers of companies that operate, say, within the City of London do so not just for access to the EU, but because London's a global financial centre. One of the reasons why London is such a big part of the UK economy is it's not just an English or British or European economy, it's a globalised economy. It's a financial centre for the world. So they operate there for international reasons, also for EU reasons, but they can also get out of this now by operating somewhere else in the EU. So there are ways around this, but a lot hangs now on what type of trade agreement the UK reaches with the EU, and that is still, it's up in the air, and it won't be settled for several years. David Davis is on record for saying that the UK and the EU would sign a trade agreement in a nanosecond because it would be the easiest trade agreement to ever negotiate because the two countries, the UK and the EU, are already aligned. Well, no, that's not how the EU sees it. This will take years and be kind of a several thousand word agreement, several thousand page document, sorry. Okay. Anyone else?
Do you think that there would be any legitimate rumblings of another referendum for Scottish independence now that Brexit is happening?
Okay, Scotland, the three areas of the UK that people worry about in terms of now diverging from the UK, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and London. Scotland's the concern because of the independence referendum in 2014. First of all, yes, after the EU referendum, the Scottish National Party were very clear, this gives us justification to start planning for a second referendum. And they began to mobilize, they began to fundraise for this, and then the general election of last year happened, and the SNP suffered the worst losses of any political party in the UK. Now, to be fair, they dominated Scottish politics, and they still are the dominant party, but they suffered a bloody nose because the Scottish people were basically saying, another referendum? You want us to vote on another thing? Like, no. Perhaps you'd like to get on and actually deliver things. And a growing recognition, as academics have pointed out for quite a while, that the SNP has been small c conservative in terms of doing things in Scotland because they didn't want to rock the boat and appear too radical because that endangered the cause for independence in terms of moderate voters. So they've now been in power for so long that people are starting to blame them for problems in Scotland, and there are significant problems. It also recognized the fact that while the Scottish do tend to be more comfortable with the idea of European integration, they're not sold on it. They're actually, there's a high degree of Euroscepticism there. I used to point out to people elsewhere in the European Union that an independent Scotland in the European Union was not going to be this committed pro-European country. It was going to be another Denmark that was going to have big red lines saying, we're not joining the Eurozone. We're not, the SNP had campaigned on independence, arguing that an independent Scotland would not join the Eurozone, would get its share of Britain's budgetary rebate, which it gets in the European Union, would not join Schengen, would keep its opt-outs, Britain's opt-outs from certain areas such as Justice and Home Affairs cooperation. And by the way, they wanted to renegotiate the common fisheries policy. So Scotland was like a little Britain. It was basically going to say, it wouldn't be as awkward, but there were going to be strong levels of Euroscepticism there. And let's not forget that back in the 1970s, when Britain voted to remain in the European Economic Community, it was the Scots that were the most Eurosceptic. You move forward 40 years, and the opinion polling in Scotland has not changed considerably. They're still voting to remain, but what we used to think of as the Eurosceptics, we now think of as the pro-Europeans in British politics. So the SNP have sensed this. They suffered a bloody nose at the election result. They've backed off from calling another referendum. That doesn't mean another referendum isn't on the cards at some point in the future. They've been very clear that they'll watch what happens with Brexit. If Brexit makes a mess of the UK and makes a mess of Scotland, then that fuels their support for a referendum at a later date. It also, however, opens up the opportunity for an independent Scotland to be outside the European Union, like Norway, which is a country that a lot of Scottish nationalists point to and say, well, why can't we be like that? And you've also got to take into account that for Scotland, its #1 economic relationship by a long way is with the rest of the United Kingdom. It's not with the European Union. And the thing that killed Scottish independence in 2014 was that the SNP had no answer to what to do about the pound sterling. They wanted to keep the pound. The idea of Scotland joining the euro is just, it's just as toxic in Scotland as anywhere else. That's not changed. And in fact, in leaving the European Union, Scotland now finds itself in a position where, as we've discovered with regard to Northern Ireland, if Britain and the European Union can't reach agreement over some form of alignment, some form of Britain staying closely connected to the single market, then there would have to be some form of hard border. And that, for the Scots, would almost certainly be a big no-no. But it doesn't mean the Scots might not vote for independence yet. It's still on the cards.
So as you mentioned before, there are similar movements going on throughout America and other parts of Europe, and you also mentioned Russian meddling. So do you feel as though it's like by coincidence that this movement has become so widespread, or do you think that there's a greater force pushing this isolationist ideology?
Okay. There are big similarities between, as you saw in terms of the background of voters for Leave compared to, say, Trump voters to some extent, voters for Remain versus more Clinton supporters. There's also an obsession in Britain that we focus on the 52% and we forget the 48%, just like in the United States. Someone was pointing out to me a while ago, everyone obsesses about Trump voters and forgets the majority of Americans who voted for Clinton. You kind of got to explain that. But there are clear similarities here in terms of attitudes towards whether it's globalization, whether it's identity politics, and concerns about imagined threats, whether they're real or imagined. One of the things people noticed with regard to immigration in the UK was that large areas that voted overwhelmingly leave were actually areas with incredibly low levels of immigration. Because, quite frankly, if you're an immigrant, you don't want to go to these places because they're poor, backward, kind of middle of nowhere places that are going nowhere. They're deindustrializing, so they're the last place you'd go to as an immigrant. But these areas voted overwhelmingly leave, partly because of an imagined threat, that there were people coming in and taking their jobs. Also because one issue which comes up is the London thing, that British politics, British media, it's all seen through a prism of London. And therefore, London is a very multicultural city, far more than the rest of the United Kingdom. I'm still amazed at the number of diplomats who don't quite grasp this. I was speaking to an American diplomat in London just before Christmas who, his guess at what was the non-white population of the UK, his guess was 30%. It's like, no, the non-white population, according to the 2011 census, is somewhere around 13-14%. You're thinking London represents what the UK looks like. But as you hear, and as I was reading the other day, large numbers of Leave supporters elsewhere in the UK were annoyed that they had this perception that Britain was being changed because London was the image that was being projected onto them. And that was the future that they were deeply unsettled with. So you've got tensions here that you also find in the United States and elsewhere between big metropolises, global cities, and rural areas or more traditional suburban areas. You've got concerns about losing control, whether that control is over the economy, whether that control is political representation, whether it's drain the swamp or London being the swamp in a way in British politics, that Westminster is a swamp that British politics needs to be drained of. The European Union, to some extent, has always, including across the rest of the European Union, been seen as a very distant institution. When you go to Brussels, one of the things I notice whenever I go there, it completely, the symbolism of the buildings is something to look at. A lot of EU buildings look like they're off a business park. There's no, you go to Washington, D.C., you fly in to Reagan Airport, you get the right side of the plane, you look down, you see this great Roman Greek city laid out, this great republic. You fly into Brussels and you're like, oh look, it could be Canary Wharf. There's almost a lack of symbolism. It's almost like this is very technocratic run. And that's something that you pick up elsewhere within the European Union, not just in British politics. And one thing that's worth noting, and this is something worth bearing in mind when you're in Brussels, why is it that the country that suffered least from the Eurozone crisis, least from the Schengen crisis, and pretty much opted out of dealing with Ukraine and didn't want to do anything on that, the country that suffered least from those voted leave? If you think about it, other countries with massive problems in the Eurozone, massive problems in Schengen, they haven't voted leave, they haven't had the Euroscepticism that has pushed towards a leave vote. Now that reflects several things, because as I said at the beginning, it's important not to forget some of the peculiarities about Britain or the United States or Germany and so forth, which mean their politics play out in a very different way. In the UK, for example, British politics has long had a very anti-European idea to it. Britain has never seen European integration as an end in itself. Britain's role in the world, if we can talk about that, has never been for the British just being a member of the European Union. If you're a member of the Baltic states, for example, joining the European Union is your role because it secures you, it binds you into the Eurozone, it binds you into European security against Russia and so forth. It gives you an equal say as a small country with bigger countries in the European Union and within European geopolitics. For Britain, that's never been an issue. So that allows Britain to do certain things or feel it can do certain things in different ways. I'll give you one example of this, of how some countries can misread the lessons of Brexit. I was in Malta last year to do some research on Brexit and picked up that their Euroskeptics draw similarities with Britain because the British media is very big in Malta, it's a former British colony, it speaks English and so forth, and they misunderstand or misinterpret the lessons of, or the signs or the issues of Brexit. They think as an island nation that depends upon financial services that they can break away from the European Union too. It's a case of you're a small micronation that is largely dependent upon the European Union to negotiate huge arrays, a huge range of issues, you cannot take the lessons of Brexit and apply them to you. But some countries think they can do that. So again, don't overlook the peculiarities here that led Britain to vote leave. There are similarities, but we've got to be careful here. Shall I give you one question to ask in Brussels? Ask whoever you meet, ask them what mistakes the European Union has made about Brexit. All the emphasis, all the debate is on what mistakes Britain has made. And I have written immense amounts on what mistakes Britain has made. Britain has made a complete arse of itself when it comes to Brexit. But there is a question to be asked, what has the European Union got wrong? It's losing one of its largest member states. That is not something to be taken for granted. It's not something that can be, as I said, they've compartmentalized it in terms of how to negotiate it, but the political ramifications of this, they're not short-term. Yes, there's been a boost for European integration in terms of support over the past year, 2 years, but Brexit is not for the 2 years of Article 50. Brexit is for life. What is going to happen in 10 years' time if the UK, yeah, it's taken a hit from Brexit, yes, it struggled, yes, it made a fool of itself, but in 10 years' time, it's doing fine. That's when the danger comes. That's when Britain becomes this model that others in the European Union can point to and say, why can't we be like Britain? Is the European Union learning any lessons in terms of the renegotiation? Should it actually have recognized that when it came to immigration, it should have given David Cameron a bigger concession over allowing the UK to limit freedom of movement? Is there a lesson here about the way the EU develops? If you think about it, the emphasis has always been on forward moving and everybody keeping up and moving forward in integration. The EU has toyed with the idea of differentiated integration, two-speed Europe and so forth. Should it have faced this issue much longer ago, longer time ago? Because there was an expectation among some in Brussels that eventually Britain will join the euro. It was this expectation that it will inevitably become one European Union that moves forward and that Britain is just a laggard in this regard. To some extent, they called that wrong. And now there's a lot of pressure on countries like Sweden, Poland, and so forth to join the euro, despite the fact that actually they might not want to join the euro. So has the EU learned any lessons from this? Or are they basically going to stick their head in the sand and think, no, Brexit is just an anomaly, it's just about Britain, it's peculiar to Britain, there's nothing to be learned there, we'll just carry on as before?
So thank you very much again. I think we know way more about Brexit. Probably we do not feel relieved after your talk. We do not feel as anxious, but at least we're more informed and aware, and we understand this is a process that is bound to last for many years. Thank you very much.
Thank you.